to look at the arrangement between the United States and Europe and to focus the attention on the 10% markup in the movement of the weapons. I mean, that is looking at an enormous tableau. What's important here is the subordination of Europe. This is the end of Europe, 500 years since the Renaissance, where Europe could be the center of the world through its colonial takeover of the rest of the world, through its early development of capitalism, through its early period of industrialization, when it could be said it was in the lead in some sense. And perhaps it wasn't the only part of the world then. I don't know much about what was going on in China that many centuries ago, but for much of the world, this was the power, the center, the wealth. And now look at it. It's like a group of children from the kindergarten being taken by their teacher to the big man's building, the White House, where they are gathered in the chairs to orate or to listen to the blather that comes out of Mr. Trump. I mean, I know what they secretly think of him because they have said that. For me, historically, that is the most important. But if you look at the trade agreement that has been reached between Mr. Trump and von der Leyen and the Europeans, the Americans will have imposed basically a 15% across the board tariff that all Europeans will have to submit to. And in exchange, the Europeans took away whatever tariffs they had, so that the United States has virtually carte blanche. By the way, that's not enough to accomplish very much, but in terms of economics and certainly in the short run. But it is enough to show that the colonial country has become the colony and the colony has become the colonizer. Britain and Europe are now minor players in a game orchestrated by Mr. Trump and the United States. And the irony of it all is that the United States is doing that because the empire is going down. They don't want to spend the money. They want to take advantage of those they control to impose the costs of a declining empire on them so that we can get, they have to commit to invest in the United States. They have to commit to buy liquid natural gas and other energy products from the United States. They have to open up their fishing and agriculture to American products, which is an important business, and so on. And so it's wonderful. You have to do all these things because we're running short of money. And the irony is that's what Mr. Besant knows that. And for someone like him, this is an achievement. And the way you see it is he focuses on the 10% markup on the... What? I find it, in the history of Europe, the humiliation. My hope is that the European people will be disgusted by what they're watching, and that you will see inside the European countries, on the left and on the right, a desire not to be dragged into this subordination. Let me remind everyone, including the Europeans, if the United States can do what it is now doing, why do you imagine that the next president will not do more of this? Because you're telling the Americans, here's a way to ease your problems. Put them on us. How are the Europeans going to sustain their social welfare program? Western Europe's welfare for its people is way ahead of what the United States does. They were able to afford that because they had no military outlays. The United States took care of that. It was a wonderful arrangement to give a military Keynesian boost to the United States, which needed it since we never got out of the Depression. World War II got us out, and the warfare budget has sustained us ever since. So we took care of that for Europe so they could use the money they would have had to spend on military to give their people health care, free education, and that Americans don't know about because it would be very difficult to get away with not giving it to Americans if they did. Okay, now what's going to happen in Europe now if they have to pay all kinds of costs? They're going to cut their welfare, so they're already busy doing it. Well, here's two things. In Germany, the polling shows that the Alternative für Deutschland now gets a bigger polling result than the Christian Democratic Party, which used to be the dominant party in Germany. So the Alternative, that's the right wing saying, we don't want to be in this position. In France, the right wing is there and has importance, but the left wing is where the action is. The left wing is the largest faction in the parliament, and they have just declared, let's blockade everything. In English is the slogan. And on September 10th, they are going into the streets of Paris, Lyon, Marseille, Nice to shut the country down. I would add, therefore, it is an empire going down. It is taking extraordinary steps. If we want to give Mr. Trump credit for recognizing that the war in Ukraine, upon which a vast amount of money was wasted over 3 years, okay. But meanwhile, what the other things they're doing, whether they're neocons or not, this is not going to work. Fooling around with Azerbaijan? You got to be kidding. What are you going to accomplish by murdering Mr. Maduro? These are the desperate acts of a declining empire, and they will be seen that way. Look, I suspect that much of the Azerbaijan noise, or in Syria, or in Venezuela, or if they renew the Taiwan noise once the Ukraine thing is put to sleep, these are indeed typical Washingtonian punches. But to me, they look like a desperate effort to maintain the theater of American imperialism once the reality is no longer available. Their problem is China and the BRICS. Those places are growing way faster than the United States is. They grew faster throughout the Ukraine war. I want to remind people, China's economic growth per year in the 5% range, American growth per year, half that, if that. And India's even faster. Russia grew faster during the war than it had been growing before, grew faster than any European country, including the United States. You're losing left, right, and center. And much of these efforts, indeed, I would argue the Ukraine war itself, is a demonstration they can't do it. And I think that's a crisis for Europe that we're not appreciating. All those people sitting around the desk of Mr. Trump in the Oval Office, these are the leaders who were born into, grew their entire careers as the allies of the United States. The ones who had been defeated in World War II, emerged from it ruined if they were on the winning side, ruined if they were on the losing side. The United States is the dominant, and they're going to rebuild Europe as it's all over for them. They picked the wrong horse, and it's too late to get off. So they're going to ride him as long as he's still standing. They will continue the war in Ukraine forever if they have to. Look at them. That's how they talk. They see no defeat. Russia keeps moving X kilometers to the west. They don't see it. It is an extraordinary display of weakness, and the theater around it shouldn't obscure that. The scariest part is the part that says that's the strategy of the United States, but then the really crucial part is that strategy is being frustrated by an equivalent opposite strategy in China and the BRICS. Okay, that means that the United States confronts a situation where it either has to act militarily now or risk losing this contest. And if it loses it, well, then the game is over and the military won't solve your problem. And you know, the irony there is that then gives the American left its opening. The American left becomes a movement that says the best thing for the United States is not a confrontation with China, which costs us too much in the way of lost quality of life in this country, given the risk that we're going to lose, that China is just too much bigger. And with the BRICS, it's ridiculous how much bigger they are. And that bigness is in the end going to overwhelm us. Therefore, stop it now. Change the policy, work out a live and let live deal with China. Learn from Ukraine. Don't do it again. Right now in the United States, that position would get an enormous number of people supporting it, left, right, and center. Well, for me, what I see is the relentless march of the decline of the American empire. It is in the interest of India to get discounted oil because the Russians give them a very good price. They're just doing business. The Russians can't sell the oil and gas in Europe. That was a European decision and an American decision. Close the market, bring Russia to its knees by depriving it of its export markets. The Russians turn to the Indians, with whom they have long trading relations. And of course the Indian, what is it you want? If Russia is accumulating Indian currency out of the oil exports to India, well, here's one thing you can be sure the Russian central banks is figuring out. It would be interesting to use those rupees to stimulate the production in India of goods that Russia would otherwise have to produce itself, or even worse, might have to import from Western Europe or the United States. They won't have to. In other words, it allows the BRICS to help each other by opening up the channels for currency movements among them. So rupees go to Russia for oil, and then from Russia back to India for exports, or maybe not. Maybe the rupees will be accepted by the Chinese to pay for things they export to Russia, because the Chinese know they can use them to buy who knows what from India, and thereby recreating what made all the other currencies, including the dollar, become bigger than wherever they started. And this is part of the BRICS replacing America in the empire story. And it's relentless. And it is much more powerful than anything they can do in Azerbaijan or Venezuela or Syria. That may look good, may make a good headline here, but it is not stopping. In the same way that the Ukraine war did not stop all the things that led up to that war. They're right, continuing. The war started, the war developed, and now the war is ending. And the other processes we've been talking about, they march on.